All right, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Deanna Minich, and we're going to spend 90 minutes together talking about one of my favorite topics, detox. And I can guarantee you that you're going to hear detox like you've never heard detox before in this talk. My definition of detox has gone beyond the traditional, perhaps, and so what I'm going to do as researcher and clinician is take you through a journey of what we mean by detox. This is, as it is titled, a very fundamental talk, and it's to help you get acquainted with toxicity and what we mean by this term detox, right, which is very charged these days. Now, the reason why I'm talking with you about detox is because I've done a lot in this field. So I've worked with the Functional Medicine Research Center on a number of different clinical trials around detoxification. Just last year, any of you attend the Detox Summit that was put on? Oh, goody. Okay, we've got some people that were part of that. So we had close to 70,000 people sign in to listen to 30 different experts talk about detoxification on all levels. So I spearheaded that last year together with the Institute for Functional Medicine. Then we ran 3,000 people through an online detox program. So my practice is a little bit different in the way of, I do see people one-on-one, but I have started to shift my practice, and I want to teach you about some skills on how you can do this, on how you can do detox in a much larger, grandiose, beneficial setting for everybody involved. Even right now, as I speak, I have a 200-person detox ongoing. So it's like there's always a detox happening somewhere. So I want to definitely give you lots of clinical nuggets. How do you do this? How do you recognize patients that need a detox? That term detox, I know it's a very charged term, and I know that there's a lot of debate around that, so we'll talk about that as well. So what I'd like to do is dive into the material. You don't have the final version on your computer, so don't get frustrated. They allowed us to adjust and tweak some slides, so based on what I knew about the people here and the attendees, I tweaked some slides, and you will get the final copy uploaded to your, I believe to the website is where you'll get that. Fabulous. Okay, so what I'd like for you to walk away with today, I'd like you to have a piece of paper and pen or your computer just to jot things down as we go. I want to be sure that I give you enough clinical pearls and enough of this basic foundational information to get you going. So I am going to take you through the biochemical and genetic pathways. When we say detoxification, one of my mentors in this field, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, has always talked about metabolic detoxification. So we are going to get into food. We're going to get into food quite deeply. And then we are going to look at the different pathways that are tailored to those different food bioactives. And then I'm going to take you on a journey in looking at other types of toxins. So as you can see here, I'm going to take you through the science support. I'm going to go through the physiological organs, the main ones that are responsible for detoxification processes in the body. I am then going to take you into the psychological realm, because if we are not addressing toxins in the psyche as we're doing a physiological detox, I don't think it can be, it's not as robust. And in fact, when I was seeing patients in the clinic, what I would notice is when I would change things in their physiology, we're doing a detox, all of a sudden other things start to change. So they decide to quit their job, they decide to get a divorce, they decide to move their house. You know, there were other things that were happening. So I couldn't ignore this huge psychological cleansing, if you will, that does happen with this process. So that'll be fun to get into. And then I'm going to actually walk you through how to sequence a detox. You know, I think that the reason why detox is criticized is because it has become kind of this mass approach to all people. And I think that there are ways to sequence it to make it safe and also to personalize it, because not everybody's the same, obviously. All right. So I would say, let me just give you first a little bit of an intro to toxins and why or how this planet has become so toxic. And I think when we come from that place and talking with patients, many times it can sound very fear-filled. And that's not the intent. The intent is to know, just to have that information. What are you dealing with? It's kind of like food. Reading the labels. Now we have to read personal care product labels. We have to read labels of things that we buy for the home. So it really goes beyond. I would say, based on my read of the literature and trends and such, really seeing the birth of this book in 1962, The Silent Spring, talking about how bird populations started to change when there was an influx of different environmental toxins. So we saw that shift dramatically, and there was this book that was written about it. So I think from that point on, and not really just that book, but we started in the 1960s to create this overall awareness around toxins in our environment. So it is really true. We do live in a toxic world. I'm reminded of that every day as we look at the news and we look at press releases coming out. And if you just look at some of these staggering statistics, it's unbelievable that there are somewhere in the neighborhood, and this could be very light in terms of the absolute quantity, but 80,000 different identified chemicals. 80,000. And we're not even taking into account the metabolites of those toxins or some of the other byproducts of those toxins. That's just a general number. The average adult, as I will show you, has 700 different contaminants at any given moment, and you as health professionals probably have a little bit more than that. Health professionals are one of those groups that is very much at risk. And then at birth, the average newborn has about 232 different toxins in their blood. So if you're very interested in the science around clinical detoxification, go to PubMed and put in this name, Stephen Genuis, Genuis. I interviewed him for the Detox Challenge, and essentially he is a professor at the University of Alberta. He's done a lot of great, groundbreaking work looking at toxins in the body and how they correlate to symptoms. And there isn't a huge plethora, there hasn't been in the past. Now we are starting to see that emergence. But look at this quote from his article, which I find very pivotal. He says, "Future generations may look back with astonishment and wonder how our culture thought it could stand by and tolerate the poisoning of its people and somehow not anticipate the ravages of widespread disordered biochemistry and ill health." You know, this whole idea of, there are so many different debates going on around whether or not people are toxic. Do we need to detoxify? And what he's saying is that this is pure negligence. If we don't recognize the role of toxins in health, we're going to be looking back later and realizing that we did something really wrong. He goes on to talk about the staggering amount of cost that's incurred from these different environmental toxins. So he estimated in the United States alone, costs from toxicity would amount to about over 80 billion based on where we are now. So how can we reverse that tide, right? So the other thing that we have to be aware of is that as our environment becomes more and more polluted, what tends to happen is that these toxins concentrate in the body over time. So the more adipose tissue we have, the chances that we have greater toxins is increased. So we have to look at how these different substances, just like on the planet, they bioaccumulate, they also accumulate within us over our lifetime. So toxic from birth, we move on from there, we become even more toxic as an adult. And I'm going to talk about some of the research. So there is this idea and this terminology around total toxic load. Total toxic load. So what does that mean? That means that we have to look at our patients' total exposure to toxins. Do they live in a city? Or do they live on a farm where there's pesticide and insecticide and herbicide spraying? And then look at their internal capacity to mobilize and metabolize those toxins. So when we take those two things and subtract them from each other, this is truly the toxic load. And of course, so many other things get wrapped up into that conversion. As I mentioned, there are studies looking at infants. If you want a really good website to look at, to be on the pulse of toxicity, go to the Environmental Working Group website, ewg.org. What I like about that site is that you get the information as well as tools, different things that you can use with patients. So as this study cites, up to 232 toxic chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of 10 babies was found. So these toxins are crossing the placenta. So we have to have concerns now for women that are wanting to conceive and making sure that a woman has a reduced toxic load before she becomes pregnant. That would be ideal, right? Now, I also mentioned that you, as health professionals, are also a very vulnerable group. So this was another study looking at blood and urine from 12 doctors and 8 nurses from 10 states in the United States, and they looked at 62 different toxicants. And you probably know a number of these, looking at heavy metals, looking at BPA, and all of these have known health effects, right? And what they found was that at least 18 of these different toxins were found in every participant. And all 20 had at least one toxin from 5 out of the 6 chemical groups, and 13 out of the 20 had at least one from all 6. So we have increased exposure, just even from a diverse population. Same group of health practitioners, but spread throughout the United States. So it's almost like, where could you live without any toxins? There are toxins everywhere that we are. And as I mentioned, if you just do a general test, and a lot of different labs are now assessing the different toxins in the body, I don't tend to do a lot of those labs because many times their symptoms will tell me that there's probably some role of toxicity already at work. So I don't tend to get so wrapped up in all of the different labs around that. So potential associations between the different diseases, the chronic diseases, and toxins. So now start thinking of your patients, the ones that have been very difficult to figure out, right? And what you can see here is that more and more we're stacking up the evidence to show that these different chronic conditions, and some of them are, I would call them newer 21st century diseases or conditions, right? Multiple chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, seeing the increase there, seeing increases in allergies overall. I'm sure that you're seeing that in your patients, right? I work a lot with patients with cancer. The amount of toxins, and I get a lot of angry patients that have cancer. They say, Deanna, I did everything right. I ate organic food. I grew my own food. I exercised. I did this and that. And sometimes there is this toxic exposure that we can't offset, we can't avoid. So as you can see, the data stack very high in terms of looking at cancer risk and cancer incidence. So allergies is also up there, but cancer in general, we're seeing more and more. When we look at these conditions, what we see is that the neurological system and the reproductive system are both very sensitive to these different toxins. I'm sure that you're aware of the book Genetic Roulette by Jeffrey Smith, looking at GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and reproductive toxicity. These two systems, when you have patients with fragility in reproduction, maybe they're infertile or have different issues, dysmenorrhea and such, check for toxicity. Same thing with neurological issues. So any kind of tremors or headaches or things that just aren't dissipating. One of the biggest reasons why people choose to do a detox, and we have data on this, is that they're coming in because of fatigue. So they're looking at, well, why? Why do I have these issues with, why can't I get out of bed? Is it adrenal fatigue? No, we ruled that out. Well, what else is it? Well, your mouth is full of amalgams. Maybe we need to look at mercury poisoning. Maybe we need to look at mitochondrial function. So let me just lay out for you some of the mechanisms as to how these toxins get into the body and start working. One of them is oxidative stress, which is why we see such an energy deficit here when it comes to toxicity. So focusing on the mitochondria, I know that some clinicians are very keen on first building up the mitochondria, making sure that we have enough in the way of coenzyme Q10, that we have L-carnitine, that we have a lot of those nutritional cofactors before taking people into a detox. That's one potential way to stage a detox, is to first really work on the mitochondria. What else do we need? Making sure that we have the correct lipids and really making sure that the patient has that foundation before we now take them into this very rigorous protocol. Because some of the detoxes, it just depends on how you do it, but some of them can be a little bit more rigorous than others. It just depends on what they need. Endocrine disruption. In fact, a lot of these toxins have been called endocrine disruptors, xenoestrogens, obesogens. They are working on the HPA-TG axis. So you get a lot of thyroid issues, you get a lot of adrenal issues, ovarian, testes issues with a lot of toxicity. What about just straight to the DNA? A lot of genotoxic effects of these toxins. And so what we see is accelerated aging in people that have an exposure to toxins. So fortifying the body's immune and repair defenses can be extremely important for helping with toxic burden. So looking at things like telomerase, right? Looking at things like antioxidant levels in the blood and measuring those against measures of oxidative stress like MDA or T-bars. Looking at that balance can be important. And then there's also enzyme inhibition. So what we tend to see here, and I'll discuss this a little bit when we talk about heavy metals, is that these metals get in and they jam up the different enzymatic pathways. So it actually makes it harder to detox because the heavy metals got in there, bound to those sulfur type of enzymes, which prevented the liver from very effectively getting other things out. So sometimes, you see this catch-22 where it's very difficult to detox somebody because a lot of those enzymes are being blocked. So you have to override those signals with much more in the way of nutrition. Dysbiosis is another thing that we see and another thing for you to be thinking about, and I'm going to show you some studies on probiotics and how they can be helpful with heavy metal metabolism and elimination. Believe it or not, these bugs can actually work for us. So for people with toxicity, what we see are changes in the gut microflora. They start having digestive issues, and they're not able to even excrete effectively these different toxicants. So here's just at a glance some of the different environmental toxins to start thinking about. So the heavy metals are big. I'm going to talk just briefly about persistent organic pollutants because I think that you should be aware of some of the research out there on chronic disease, like type 2 diabetes, like obesity. You should have that connection. There are food-based toxins, things like heterocyclic amines, advanced glycation end products that we see with overcooking when we don't have the right spices and herbs and phytonutrients in the foods to protect them. The xenoestrogens, which I'll cover. The EMFs, electromagnetic fields, that we're learning much more about. Some more research is coming out on that, and I continue to monitor that. And then, of course, we can go on about other toxins. Is gluten a toxin? Gluten, we hear so much about gluten intolerance. Is that a toxin, or is it a physiology that has been altered through the exposure to toxicity, and now we can't handle that? So let me just show you, I think that this is key for your clinical understanding. How did toxins get this term of being an obesogen? I think that this is really relevant to note. Various people like Walter Crinian and other people in environmental medicine, they would say that sometimes these toxins might actually make the body store more fat because the body's trying to dilute the effects of those toxins. Or it could also be that these toxins are changing up metabolic pathways in the body that are leading to obesity. So as you can see here, two of the main types of metabolic pathways. On top we have glycolysis. On the bottom we have the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle. And everywhere that you see a red arrow is where estrogen comes into the picture. So that's why we see with perimenopausal women, postmenopausal women, some disturbances or some changes in metabolism. Why can't she lose weight? So similarly, a lot of these toxins, which are acting as xenoestrogens, can get in and start changing a number of these different pathways that are related to metabolism. So really important to really be focused on very basic strategies like detoxing and working with somebody as they're losing weight. I don't know about you, but clinically what I have seen is that many times people don't feel as well when they start to lose weight. You know, and you can't really describe why that would be. Aren't you happy? Or, you know, but they feel like this depression and energy sometimes, and things are shifting in their physiology. There's been some idea that there is an influx of toxins that were held in the adipose tissue that are now coming out into the bloodstream. And I have some data to suggest that that's probably the case. Another one of these toxins that I do think you should be very familiar with in clinical practice is the role of persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. So this is a very diverse group of chemicals. It encompasses a number of different classes of compounds. So everything from the polychlorinated compounds to Teflon and, you know, the triclosan, which is in a lot of the antimicrobial soaps. So just think of it, anything that is chlorinated. And this is where I start to even think about women and tampon use, right? Chlorine in contact with mucous membranes. You know, we have to have some awareness around all those different exposures. Even sucralose, otherwise known as Splenda. What is it? It's a chlorinated disaccharide, right? So this influx that we have of a lot of these different chlorinated compounds can be changing our physiology in big ways. So the long and the short of it is that these POPs, and a lot of great work has been done at the University of Minnesota on this. Dr. Dave Jacobs is one of the researchers that is key for looking into this area. And what he showed with his collaborators is that these POPs, high levels of POPs in the body, are correlated with increased markers of inflammation. So here's another study. Being that I have my eye on cancer due to the work that I'm currently doing, this study was very interesting because they took samples from women with breast cancer. So they took a biopsy of the cancerous tissue, and then they took a sample of the tissue that was adjacent to the tumor, and they found a number of different compounds, chlorinated compounds, in the tissue that was adjacent to the tumor, not even just in the tumor itself, but also in the adjacent tissue. So do these chlorinated compounds have a role in cancer and a lot of the disruption of these physiological processes? And the answer is yes. Similarly, the same study looked at proliferation rates of cancer, and this was correlated with the amount of organochlorines that they had assessed. So higher organochlorines in the body were correlated with higher proliferation rates in the breast. Now, if we look at a clinical marker that would be good for you to write down and just note this, and I use this a lot with patients, and it's covered by insurance. It's very easy to do. Of course, we have ALT and AST as standard liver enzymes, but another one, GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, appears to be upregulated or even at the high end of normal for people that have some toxic exposure. Typically, this is an enzyme that is elevated in the case of alcoholics or anytime we have really reduced our glutathione reserves. But we're seeing in Dr. Jacobs' work and others that just high normal serum GGT is associated with type 2 diabetes. It's also associated with obesity. And you don't have to be overweight as a diabetic to really, what you can see is that the toxins are leading to the diabetic condition, perhaps even more sometimes than being obese. There's something about how those toxins are changing up mitochondrial function and metabolism. So in your type 2 diabetics, be looking at GGT. Be looking and be aware of detoxification in these patients. So here's a study. Now, I'm sure that you'll find this interesting because probably one of the primary reasons why people come to see you is that what? Either they want more energy or they want to lose weight. So this is where you do have to start thinking of detoxification. In this study, what they showed was that the more weight that was lost, so what we see here is that this line shows the amount of body weight, and you can see how it's coming down. And as the body weight is coming down, what's going up? The organochlorine concentrations in the blood. So all the more reason to really equip patients with detoxification strategies while they're trying to lose weight. And that will help them to prevent that kind of low energy feel that they have. And I predict, and there's no science on this, but I'm just putting this out there as a theory, that when we find that plateau that happens with weight loss, that perhaps that's even connected to the toxic load, that the body is trying to assimilate and trying to physiologically get rid of those toxins, right? All right, so one more thing on the different toxins before we start getting into detox a little bit more in the strategies. I'm sure all of you know about bisphenol A, right? BPA-free bottles, BPA-free water bottles. We're seeing it everywhere. It's a great marketing pitch. As I started to look into this, I think it was about 3 years ago, I started to look into bisphenols in general. And what I noticed is that it's actually a very complex chemical family. There's not just A, there's B, there's C. There are almost as many letters as there are in the alphabet for the different bisphenols. So keep this in mind when your patient is saying, well, I'm doing okay, I'm drinking water from a BPA-free bottle, or I'm eating Eden Foods BPA-free canned foods, isn't that okay? But you have to ask yourself, what are they substituting the BPA with? And there was a study that came out on BPS, which is a common substitute for BPA. We tend to find BPS in thermal paper receipts, tickets, like from airline tickets, boarding passes and such, luggage tags. You know, travel is already toxic, and now you have to think about all these things, right, that you have to touch. Even when I'm in the grocery store, I do my little education telling the cashier about those receipts, you know, the thermal receipts, which are very high in BPA, and even the ones that they're using BPS on. So BPS is also incredibly toxic, and in one study that came out, it was shown to be even more toxic than BPA. So please have that in mind. Just have your patients wipe out all plastics whatsoever. Just say no to plastic, and there'll be a lot of benefit just from that. So so now that's all going to sound very negative, right? Because it sounds like, well, gosh, you know, we can't really live in this environment. Essentially, when we start to reduce these things in our exposure to them, and this was even talked about in the book Slow Death by Rubber Duck, where they did an experiment where they stopped their use of a lot of these different, whether it was personal care products or different food preparations, and essentially they were able to reduce their toxic burden within days. So it's not impossible. This study right here that was out in 2011 showed that an organic, fresh food diet, meaning going into the produce section and not buying things in plastic or eating out of cans, dropped BPA levels by 66% within 3 days. So this should be an incentive. This should be a talking point for you with patients. You know, you can do this. It's not like it has to be a long, drawn-out process, right? You can start making these changes and seeing them quickly. Really important for, again, women that are wanting to conceive. So let's talk about patients that need a detox, right? And I would say that we're always doing something at some point that would necessitate supporting our body's detoxification systems. There are lots of lifestyle factors. I mentioned travel as one of them. I wrote an article once, it was called The Toxic Terrain of the Plane. You know, you get hot water in styrofoam cups, you've got peanuts with aflatoxins, you're breathing stale air, you know, there's just layers and layers. And think of how many people travel, right? So it's a lot of these things, how active we are. One of my guiding principles to patients is, I don't care what activity you do, just sweat. Because according to the research from Dr. Jennis, he did a study that I'm going to show you. It was called the BUS study, blood, urine, and sweat. And he found that it was sweat that was the conduit for the release of just about all toxins, including heavy metals. There were some perfluorinated carbons that did not come out in sweat, but pretty much everything else was coming out in sweat. It was a great vehicle to get things out. So if we're not physically active and we're not sweating, chances are we're going to contain those toxins more. I'm also going to talk about stress as a toxin. I'm going to talk about social networks as toxins. So good to look at their lives, right? Are they obese? Were they a lifetime dieter? I'm not showing you the studies on this, but they have found that people that go through sequential dieting throughout their lives actually have higher levels of toxins. And that's because each time they go on their diet and they lose weight, they're releasing those toxins, but they never did anything to actually detoxify. So look at those lifetime dieters and those people with eating dysfunctions and eating issues. Are they using lots of personal care products? I can remember that I had a patient some time ago where we were spending about a year just focusing on autoimmune disease. So she had Sjogren's and she had a lot of issues. She was doing really well with food, but there was something missing for her. So, and I could tell that she wore makeup and she did her hair. And so I asked her, I said, next time you come in, can you just bring all of your personal care products with you? Just bring them in a bag and let's just look at them because there's something we're not getting here. Well, she comes back at her next visit and she has a garbage bag, literally a black garbage bag, and we spent an hour just going through everything in there. Lotions, deodorant, conditioners, shampoos, all of that stuff that's coming into contact with things as part of our physiology in which it can be absorbed. So that was kind of her breaking point. Once we went through those things and we started reading those labels, we should read those labels like we read our food labels, seriously. All the things that are in those products is tremendous. So that really helped her, by the way. Sometimes we have to look beyond the food. I also had another patient who was a Vietnam vet. He was 62 years old. He had just gone to his VA hospital, and he had just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, right? And so we start looking at everything. It wasn't just his food, but it seemed like because he had had this toxic exposure, just being exposed to dioxin or Agent Orange, and all these years having these metabolic effects. And when we're young, we're resilient. But as we start to get older and have these metabolic changes, it becomes more difficult to actually compensate. So with him, he had elevated GGT. We were seeing all the signs of toxicity with him. So he responded very favorably to doing we worked with him on his liver in terms of giving him liver bioactives to increase the metabolism of a lot of these things that he was holding on to. All right, so and a lot of these different other chronic conditions and complaints you're going to see. And I would say when you don't know where else to go, start to think in this direction, right? So here's the typical patient portfolio. They come in, they're the walking wounded, they're feeling unwell, they're achy, they're fatigued all the time, they've got no energy, their moods change, they have no concentration, no focus. Again, because toxins impact reproduction and neurological activity, we want to be looking at what could happen as a result of that. How many of you when you're taking their history, do you ask about toxic exposures? Just show of hands, I'm just curious. Okay, it's probably about 5% of you. There are some great questionnaires that you can use, like the Adult Toxin Exposure Questionnaire, which is available online. I would recommend that you have some basic questions about exposure to toxins. Just looking in their mouth, do they have amalgams? Just starting there. Where do they live? Do they smoke? There are some basic things that you can be connecting the dots on. Have they been constipated? Do they suffer from gut dysfunction? We're going to get into the gut and all the roles there. So really, I think that there are many indications for helping people along here. For some people, like the 200 women that I've got going in this detox right now, I would say that for some of them, it's more or less, they need a reset. They just need a supercharge. Usually beginning of the year is when people are looking for something fresh. It's not like they have a lot of chronic conditions. Sometimes it's just a matter of, feeling that resetting in body, mind, and spirit. As I mentioned, looking at amalgams, autism, any kind of behavioral issues or mood changes, people that eat a lot of fish. In fact, there was a study that showed that mercury that is in fish and overdoing it on fish consumption can negate the beneficial effects of EPA and DHA. So you want to be assessing, and there are the nrdc.org, that's a great website you can go to, nrdc.org. They have great And they update these graphics in terms of high mercury containing fish, medium, low mercury containing fish, so that you can give that to your patient, right, so that they can assess how much they're eating. So my basic flow when it comes to taking them through the clinical trajectory on this is first having that initial consultation, doing an intake form, and essentially just seeing what their exposures are. MSQ, the Medical Symptoms Questionnaire. Just show of hands just so I can see how many of you are familiar with MSQ. Okay, this is another thing that you can go online and find. I see that many of you don't know about the MSQ, Medical Symptom Questionnaire. The Toxic Exposure Questionnaire, which you can also find. I also like to use the Functional Medicine Timeline. In other words, plotting, just like that Vietnam vet when we were talking about his toxic exposures, we were talking about when he was 22 going to Vietnam. You know, that's one right there. When he was 25, coming back and getting some amalgams in. You know, starting to put it all together and now coinciding their symptoms with that trajectory of toxic exposures, right? It's a very basic activity, but very useful and very informative. And then looking at their vulnerabilities. In our nutrigenomic seminar that we had on Thursday, we talked about a lot of these gene variants that patients might have. This might predispose them to being less of a detoxer, holding more things in the body. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more. And then once I get a good sense from that first consultation, I typically work with a functional medicine MD. We are looking at physical exam, general labs, and functional labs, and SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, in other words, the gene variants. So when I mention the timeline, this is the basic format that can be used for that. And notice all the way to the left of the timeline, we have preconception and prenatal. Don't forget to ask about what the patient knows about what their mother did when she was pregnant. Sometimes some of that is passed on, right? Did she have huge stress? Was she eating a lot of fish? Were there certain behaviors that she had during her pregnancy? Log it, because that is so relevant, especially for toxicity and looking at the epigenetic effects long term. So here's the process clinically. Essentially determining, once you have that first consultation, looking at whether the symptoms fit into what is known about toxins, because of course there are so many different protocols and ways to go with this. You know, if they have autoimmune disease, you might want to work first on their inflammation before you take them into a detox protocol, right? You need to assess the severity of their symptoms. So I remember one patient we had, she had some SNPs, some gene variability in IL-6. So she was very prone to inflammation. So anything that we did with her on the detox side would just inflame her. She'd get a rash. So we had to move very slowly. So using the MSQ was very good for us because you can see the more fragile patient, and from there you can tweak detoxification strategies. And then reducing toxic triggers, of course, looking at the obvious of what's in their environment, supporting their organ systems, which I'm going to take you through with different nutrients. And feel free, as we get into the different nutrients, I'm going to reserve some time for questions. So write down any questions you have about how to use these nutrients and these supplements. I was actually part of a group that did a lot of work on medical foods and other types of supplements in order to facilitate detoxification. And then you want to transition them into a maintenance program. Some people are just going to need additional liver support and gut support for life. It's just because of their genetic variability, or maybe they can't move from where they're at in Michigan, which is really high in arsenic and a number of other toxicants. They've got to stay there. So how do we support them nutritionally, right? There are other ways to go around it. So my basic approach to detoxification, some of the elements that I bring in clinically, is first I focus on food. Get them going with nutrient-dense, phytochemical-rich food. Really extremely important. And do the obvious, remove the food triggers, right? And we're going to talk about the different dietary approaches. Bring in supplements, and many times what I will do is I'll start with smaller things first, the obvious things first, and then I'll start to layer in the supplements so then I can see what is doing what. You know, because for some people with a lot of fragility and a lot of symptoms, I don't want them to have any type of just a reaction in terms of, not from the supplements, but just from the process of letting go of a lot of these toxicants. I want to be very supportive to that process. And then, of course, I do look at their lifestyle. Don't forget to bring in lifestyle. I know it feels so common sense for us, but it's so important and supports everything else that you're doing in that detox. So I think that the reason why detoxification, or the word detox, has had a bad reputation is because everybody is doing it in different ways. There's no standard of care around detoxification, right? Even my approach to detox is going to be very different than yours. And so I'm sure you've seen the foot pads out there, or the foot baths, right? There's even a study looking at, and you know how you put your feet in this water and the color changes, it looks murky and dark, like, oh my goodness, I've got toxins. I mean, there have actually been studies looking at assessing that water and not finding that there's anything toxic. It's just some kind of metal reaction of that unit in the water. So things like this give detoxification a bad name, right? Because you might be better served calling it metabolic biotransformation or something, right? Instead of detox, because otherwise there is this kind of wedding to this just a huge amalgam of all these different approaches that may or may not have any type of great science. So here's a cartoon that speaks to that. It draws the toxins out of my body and dumps them back into the environment, right? It doesn't even draw the toxins out of your body, actually. Let's modify that cartoon. So, there's a lot of criticism, and as a physician or a health professional of some type, there is this degree of scrutiny around, detox. And this article that came out in 2005, Detox Diets Provide Empty Promises, ? And essentially, look at how they define detox. You can see it right here. Vegetable, fruit, and water regimen. Well, I don't know what that means exactly. What is that, like some very stringent fasting, or, their version of detox and what they're referring to can be very different than what we actually do in practice. So for me, the way that I see detoxification, it's balancing the internal environment and reducing the external exposure. Here's how I define a toxin to my patients. I say, a toxin is any barrier to your health, any barrier. So as you can see, it has a very general connection there to many different things. But if we are speaking to, typically in the medical fields, we think of hepatic detoxification, right? And this is where I'm going to take you through this process. But we are taking things that are toxic and lipophilic, moving them through the liver, making them hydrophilic, and then excreting them into one of the different bodily fluids. Detoxification is not new, by the way. Many systems have used detoxification practices, Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, and I think that we are just going to continue to redefine these practices as we move into the 21st century. So let's dive in talking about nutrition specifically. There are a number of studies out there looking at the influence of these actives on our DNA, on these hepatic enzymes, on the gut function. I'm going to take you through each of these concentric circles, really focusing on the physiology first. So as we get into the physiology, let's just break down the different organ systems and how we can support them, right? And this is a very basic way of how I teach patients. I said we're going to focus on your 5 major organs of detox. First, we're going to focus on your gut, which is, we call this, even in Chinese medicine, right? We think of the spleen, the peacemaker. We're trying to make peace with our bacteria and everything else going on there. So I don't think it's a very good idea to start working on the liver and start creating all these changes metabolically without first making sure that the patient is eliminating. They're constipated, they're just going to be recycling those toxins. So really important to look at the integrity of the gut. Do they have leaky gut? Looking at their enterohepatic circulation. And this is important too because you probably know this, but 80% of mercury is excreted through the stool. So if you're not working on the stool and making sure that things are flowing, then chances are there's just going to be reabsorption. So the gut is the first defense against toxins. And we think always of elimination, but built into the enterocytes, we actually have these little proteins, these antiporter proteins that cycle and shuttle toxins out. So that's the first line defense. So when things are trying to get in, fortunately, we have these proteins working at the gut level to enable these things to be taken out immediately if they've gotten in. So one of the hepatic enzymes that's also, this enzyme is found throughout the body, is called CYP3A4. We tend to see that there is a correlation between these gut antiporters and this CYP3A4. 50% of pharmaceuticals go through 3A4. So if we have a patient with a SNP or a genetic variability in 3A4, chances are this system, their gut antiporter system, is not going to work as well. So there are a number of different things that can change the function of the antiporters throughout the body, i.e. we can slow it down through things like grapefruit juice. We can change it through St. John's wort. So we can actually make this process less or even more efficient with things that we're taking in. We also want to look at making sure that we have good bile flow. Bile is needed to emulsify fats. Very important to make sure that things are getting out of the liver through the bile. So one other thing to be thinking about when we focus on gut health and gut function. So there are three basic things that you can be thinking about in terms of stimulating the bile through lipotropic factors. Very easy to do. B vitamins, very effective for helping with that. Choline, which acts as more or less an emulsifier on its own. Probiotics, and we're going to get into why that is. And just even fiber. These are three nutritional strategies that you can be thinking about when it comes to that first line approach of working on the gut. So in terms of healthy bile flow, what you do want to be thinking, as I mentioned, the B vitamins, vitamin C, taurine, methionine. What are some of those different amino acids that are used for bile acid synthesis? So making sure, and you're going to see that protein is really inherently important for the whole process of detoxification. There are also a variety of different herbs that you can use to stimulate bile acid production, formation, and then contraction by the gallbladder. So artichoke leaf is an example of one. Bitters, anything bitter. Arugula would be an example of a bitter, great bitter, and is also high in dietary nitrates. Dr. Walter Crinian talks about just even helping the patient to understand that not that we want to make them reduce fat in the diet because we think fat is bad, but because fat can be a conduit of these persistent organic pollutants and such. So if they're getting high quality meats, then I think that that's a very good thing, right? This is just one of the strategies to think about overall. Dr. Crinian and some naturopathic physicians have talked about using high doses of fat in various settings, like even using Olestra, which is a fat substitute. I don't even think that that's available on the market anymore. But using these different, basically, whether it's just a variety of different ones to trap fat, large doses of coconut oil in one setting. No science on this, but it's being talked about in terms of having controlled settings where you use fat in very therapeutic ways to act as a medium for different things to sink into. So, and we're seeing even in the science that a lot of these chlorinated compounds and such just sink naturally into those things. It's so important to make sure that your patient's on probiotics, not just to restore the gut flora, but because the gut flora is responsible for how we actually metabolize toxins. So this is a great article talking about how xenobiotics shape the physiology and gene expression of the active human gut microbiome. And this study specifically just came out last year. I love this study. What they showed in this women in Tanzania, they had women on yogurt that was supplemented with certain bacterial strains versus women just given milk as a control. And they found that the women that had the probiotic yogurt had reductions in mercury and arsenic compared to the women that just had the milk. So there's something that's happening, and we could say, well, is that because we're changing the leaky gut, or is it because we're changing elimination, or is it because we're seeing metabolism by those different gut microflora? And I would say yes, probably yes to all those three things. So I know it's not very sexy, it's kind of mundane, but we do have to ensure fiber, just simple fiber. Most people that I see aren't getting enough fiber. So that's going to help and feed the good bacteria. After you're repleting with probiotics, you have to follow up with some type of fiber to ensure that they're sticking around, right? And one of the things just clinically I've noticed, even in talking with a variety of different people, is just about the dose of probiotics. You know, some people say that a maintenance dose of 15 billion is good. My sense from my circles of colleagues, medical colleagues and such, and what we tend to use is mixed strains. So not just one strain or two strains, but really the complexity is very good. Unless you know that specifically you've got a stool sample that's lacking bifidobacteria, and then you need to replete with high amounts of that particular bacterium. But really to have mixed strains, and just think about it, the larger the person, the bigger the gut. You're going to need more probiotics. I think that eventually what we should have in dietary supplement dosing is the dose or the milligrams per kilogram body weight. Because right now we just do a shotgun approach of, just all my patients will take 50 billion. But we may or may not see the good effects of that. So keep that in mind. I remember adjusting doses time and time again for that increased body weight. It's also important to be thinking about these probiotics because for women and men alike, it's going to help with getting estrogen out of the body. Estrogen is usually glucuronidated and put out by the bile into the small intestine, travels down, and if we've got poor microflora, what's going to happen is a deconjugation of that glucuronide group and then a reabsorption of estrogen. Why can't women get rid of this estrogen excess? Well, are they constipated? What about their gut microflora, right? Just some basic things. So here's what I just described in a pathway form. So glucuronidation of estrogen in the liver. The body actually treats estrogen like a toxin. So just think of it in that way, and it can be very toxic in a variety of different patients, right? Conjugates estrogen, excretes it into the bile, which eventually you're excreting into the stool, unless you get upregulation of this enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, which can cleave off the glucuronide group, release the free estrogen into the gut, and then you get resorption. And there are certain probiotics that you can take in order to prevent that from happening. This study also just showed about fiber that it helped with estrogen excretion, just getting things out, transit time, asking the obvious question, how many bowel movements per day are you having? And I worked with Dr. Jack Kornberg at one point, and I remember him, and he was a surgeon, and he got very passionate about poop. And he would say, it's got to be as long as your forearm. Anything less than that doesn't count as your one bowel movement per day. So ask those very difficult, kind of tenuous questions. Who wants to talk about poop, right? But it's really important when we're talking about detoxification to have that discussion. And after a while, people feel kind of fun with it and kind of play with it and talk about that as a fun topic when they come in to see you. So ensuring adequate water intake, you can also cause constipation if you've got too much fiber and you don't have adjunctive water coming in. Vitamin C and magnesium citrate can also be helpful with constipation. How many of you know of a gut healing program called the 5-Hour Program? We're not going to have time to go into it, but this would be something to be thinking about for your patient before you actually take them into the liver sequence. Methylation. We've been hearing a lot from the different talks here about methylation. Methyl groups come from a variety of different foods, really important for getting certain toxins out of the body. So just note that these things that bind, like the methyl groups, are important. We need more of those during detox. Chlorophyll. One of the very simple things that, in fact, for this patient who had the IL-6 SNP, anything that we did, eventually we just went to chlorophyll, which binds heterocyclic amines, it binds aflatoxins, it's anti-mutagenic. She did very well on this, actually. And it supports some of the liver pathways. So doing a stabilized chlorophyllin or just having them buy the liquid chlorophyll from the store is also a nice addition to their water. We also know that it provides support against a variety of different environmental toxins. So really good if you've got people living in a city or exposed to diesel fumes and exhaust to really bring in chlorophyll. Here's another clinical pearl. What we're learning about these polyphenols, the different phytonutrients that are in fruit and vegetable products, especially berries, is that they are worked on by the gut microflora. So we can get even greater potential from phytonutrients if we've got good microflora metabolizing them. So I mentioned previously about having patients when they're taking their berries or their berry smoothie to make sure that they have their probiotic that they're taking, or a little bit of yogurt if they do yogurt. That is actually a very good therapeutic combination of having the plain unsweetened yogurt with berries for that reason of really emphasizing the phytonutrient conversion. So I'm just going to show you some beautiful foods that could be used for the gut, right? When I talk with patients about beets, which is great for betaine, which will be helpful for bile and also liver function, I also say, well, don't forget about the beet greens, you know, the fiber, the alkalinity that you get from those greens. Just beets in general, I think are great during a detox. Nuts and seeds are also wonderful. Sesame contains sesamin and a variety of different oils that help with, and this is more moving up to the liver now, but helps with hepatic oxidation of fats. So if they can do nuts, I like to have them do that. I bring in bitters as we go through, especially for the gut function. And this is well known in traditional medicine. It's also now being seen a lot more in medical and scientific journals that we have these gut receptors that key into bitter compounds that change our motility and function. All right, so let's talk about nutrients for the liver. The liver, I always think, I'm married to an acupuncturist, and so we always have those east-west conversations. And so, you know, the liver in Chinese medicine is the general. It tells all the other organs what they need to be doing. It's very demanding, and it needs to work well, right? So with the liver, it's all about that relationship of not too much and not too little, and that's what I think about with a detox. You know, all of these stringent measures with fasting and such, I don't think that that's essentially what the liver needs at its core in order to work well. I think that what we're seeing, Dr. Mark Houston talks about this, especially with cardiovascular health, but seeing how intermittent fasting, doing this longer 12 to 14-hour nightly fast might be helpful for certain people with their liver function. So, and it also helps with mitochondrial function. We see that a lot. So if you have patients with ALS, Parkinson's, dementia of various types, using the coconut oil, and then also the science there's a great review article looking at these different neurological conditions and showing the benefit of intermittent fasting and other types of fasting regimens for these folks. So, but I'm not talking about rigorous, don't eat anything the whole day for numerous days. I don't think that that is very useful for detox. Similarly, I get this question all the time. I'm sure that you got this question from your patients at some point. What about juicing? And usually when you say detox to somebody, they think that you're going to go on a juice fast for an extended period of time. And this is, you know, thank goodness we have Vitamixes and NutriBullets now, and what's the one I have at home? The Ninja, right? You know, these processors where you're pulverizing, you're not juicing. Juicing, I have found, and I've done it clinically with people, and it's not good. It's not good from the point of, it's just like liquid sugar, right? And you've got all of this sugar. You don't have the fiber. You don't have the complexity of the phytonutrients. You get a greater glycemic response. And for people that are on a detox, having these huge spikes of sugar and then coming down, this is not very good overall. So I'm not an advocate of juicing unless they are coupling that somehow with a protein-containing meal. So it's not like I'm banishing juice. I just think it's preferred and beneficial, especially for detox purposes, to have the whole food. And there's a great turmeric milkshake without milk that I have patients make, especially during that detox, bringing in spices into a lot of these different smoothies. So nutrition is essential. Diets that are restricted in protein or nutrients will actually inhibit or change or reduce the amount of activity that the liver can undergo in terms of its metabolism. So nutrition is really at the hub there. And it seems that toxins can even be worse in the presence of things in the diet that are more inflammatory. So when you put PCBs in the body. That's already inflammatory. But when you put them together with omega-6 fatty acids, what you see in these studies is an even greater perturbation in inflammation. Same thing the other way. As we start to bring in more of the anti-inflammatory bioactives, we start seeing more improvements in different processes that relate to detox. So the polyphenols, the omega-3, sulforaphane, and resveratrol, which all upregulate the antioxidant response element series of enzymes that are responsible for detoxification. I get this question all the time: is a detox diet an elimination diet? This is very common, right, where we just take out the top 8 allergens and just say, follow this. I think it's a good starting place. However, I do think that a detox diet, so to speak, needs to take out those offenders and also build in support. So I think it's good to start with a basic guideline of this elimination diet, and you will have this in your slides if you'd like to look at it. And what I did with this elimination diet is I went through food by food, and the ones in green on the left are the ones that are particularly supportive for detox processes. So I have patients make sure that they're getting adequate amounts of those particular foods as they're moving through. So it's kind of like an elimination diet mixed with a detox liver supportive diet. It's a hybrid. Usually when people go on an elimination diet, they feel like this, right? They feel deprived. They feel like they are not able to eat much. But this is temporary. And I would say that the first 7 to 10 days of any detox is typically most rigorous. So, you know, you get them asking all of those questions, right? You were probably at the restaurant at some point being here, and we see this great gluten-free menu that they have. So fortunately, we don't have to ask all those questions now. When we take out those foods, what I have patients do is then add them back in sequentially and then observe their effects. And typically, the time frame to do that in is 21 to 28 days, where you have them remove those foods, and then you start to add them back in slowly. And everybody has their weak spot. You know, what starts to flare up? They notice that their gut got bloated, or their skin formed a rash, or they got constipated. That's a very common one. Their energy level went down. So they become their best experiment through the process. I have them load up on color throughout the detoxification. In fact, the detox that I have going on right now with these women, every day is a color. So we focus on red foods on one day, and I teach them about the properties of red foods and polyphenols and what that does to the body. The next day is orange. We talk about the carotenoids and how these carotenoids are protective in the liver. So I really make color a big deal. I thought I would put this in here for you. Many times you see that there are these detox superfoods, right, where so beneficial but no data. It's like, how did you come to the conclusion that those foods are superfoods? So what I did was I had a student work with me, and we went through the USDA database, which now has flavonoids, polyphenols, carotenoids, and isoflavones, and we added up for each of the different plant foods the sum of those different phytonutrients to really truly get what are the biggest bang for the buck in terms of phytonutrients. And I give this to patients because if they don't have, you know, I want them to eat smarter when they're on a detox. I want them to really get the most nutrition from what they're eating. So carrots up at the top, you know, dehydrated carrots that just not as practical perhaps. Collard greens, cocoa beans, beet greens, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, watercress, Swiss chard, bok choy. What are you seeing here? Green. A lot of greens, which is something that we definitely bring into the detox. I'll just give you some other tips too, and keep in mind that patients want to know this stuff, right? Like if they have to just choose certain spices and herbs, which ones are most antioxidant rich? In this study in particular, cloves came to the top, followed by mint, allspice, cinnamon, and oregano. This is looking specifically at antioxidants here. We're not talking phytonutrient levels. What about beverages? Well, I starred the ones, even though they're the top 3, these are the ones that typically patients can't have, right? So then you focus on other things like green tea and pomegranate. Pomegranate is great for the liver, for detox. The different nuts and legumes and grains, this is where I also have them focused. Chestnuts, not a common one, right? But some of these other ones are very good for a detox and also very antioxidant rich. Berries, fruits, and vegetables, amla, rose hips, bilberries, moringa, and apples. These came to the top. Again, this is like sifting through data after data in this particular article just to call out, if we want our patients to eat smarter, how do we advise them? In this, looking at soups, sauces, gravies, and dressings, anything, my whole master's was on carotenoids. And we know that you need some degree of cooking to liberate a lot of those phytonutrients, right? Many people think that when they do a detox, it should be raw food. And this is not necessarily the case in terms of getting the biggest phytonutrient load. So having them cook food is very important. All right, so I just want to show you briefly, I know we're right before lunch, so this is very heady at this time. I just want to bring the clinical distillation away from this for you. Essentially, within the cell, there is this connection to NRF2, which can go and sit on a part of the genome that corresponds to the antioxidant response element, which makes a lot of detox genes, essentially, and enzymes. So what stimulates NRF2 to be liberated and go and sit on and basically catalyze ARE? Berries. There's some great science that show that berry constituents like quercetin, camphorol, and pterostilbene all synergistically act, and these three things are already found in berries. We also know that NRF2 is upregulated by curcumin, EGCG from green tea, and caffeic acid, which is in a host of different fruits and vegetables. Also, I thought I'd bring in this article, which is fairly recent, showing that PCBs, the polychlorinated biphenyls, can initiate inflammation, but again, that we can worsen or increase the positive effects on NRF2 through nutrition. So omega-3 fats, together with flavonoids, can have this beneficial response on NRF2. If I was stranded on a desert island, and I knew I had to survive, I'd want three things with me. I'd want turmeric. I better have turmeric because it has the activity of 16 different pharmaceuticals. I'd want some kind of cruciferous vegetable, probably broccoli, and dental floss, so I can reduce my CRP, right? And plus, I'd have to keep my teeth so I can eat. When it comes to detox, and I always tell patients this, how important it is that they use spices. And turmeric, in general, seems to protect against mercury exposure. It seems to bind to mercury. Just make sure, though, that your patients are getting good quality spice sources, because on the contrary side, a lot of these spices and a lot of these roots that grow in the ground, like turmeric, can get contaminated with whatever's in the soil. So you definitely want to be sure that they're buying spices not in plastic containers, that they are organic. There are a number of great brands that are out there. You're going to see this article that's going to come out in probably the next couple of 3 to 6 months or so. We did some research. We went into all of the literature to look at what upregulates the ARE enzymes. And this is very, very recent. This is done in December. So it's not just those things I showed you. It is indeed fish oil. And I did put the clinical notes there so you know how much to use when it comes to patients. Lycopene, resveratrol, ginger, purple sweet potato even, isoflavones. You wouldn't technically be using coffee during a detox unless you were using it in a way that would help your patient who had a genetic variability. All right, so let's zip through this next section. There is this idea that, that we're always having, people ask the question, why detox? There's no special detox that we need to do. It's always occurring in the body. And yes, it is. These systems of biotransformation are always occurring in different tissues. We usually think of the liver, but it's much broader than that. So there's phase 1, where we take something that's lipophilic and we make it hydrophilic. It's a very basic process. I'm not going to take you through all of the different enzymes. I put this in here for your reference, but there are hundreds of these different cytochrome P450 enzymes that are part of that process. And many of them are not very well defined. We have some that are classified in certain ways, and we know about them. We know what the variability in those genes would be. So they respond to a number of different things. They respond to inflammation, they respond to fasting, they respond to the presence of nutrients. So what I'm going to do is take you through a tour of what you need in order to support those CYP enzymes. And by the way, it's not just foods that tap into those different cytochrome P450 enzymes, it's also pharmaceuticals. So if you have a patient that is on polypharmacy, you need to be thinking about how these different actives that you're bringing in are going to be changing the metabolism of those drugs that they're on. In fact, it's thought that much of the reason why people have side effects, like my father, for example, who has a SNP in his 2D9, has a lot of issues with warfarin. So, we have to think about what are they on, what do they have issues with, and then how can we bring in foods to either inhibit or induce that enzyme. All right, so there are things in the environment that can change some of the function of those liver enzymes as well, like alcohol, like being outside and getting exposed to air pollution can change it. Smoking can change the function of some of these. So I'm sure you get this question, right? Especially within detox, I always get this question, Deanna, why can't we have coffee during the detox? Is it good for me? Is it bad for me? And Dr. Houston showed some nice work on this the other day. This is from JAMA 2006, showing that it just depends. It depends on your cytochrome P450 enzymes, in particular 1A2. 1A2 inactivates caffeine. So if you have good 1A2 activity in the liver, which can be measured and assessed through labs, chances are, that might be better. You might be able to tolerate caffeine. So what they showed here in this group of 4,028 Costa Ricans, 50% with history of one heart attack and 50% controls, is that 2 copies of the slow gene plus drinking greater than 4 cups of coffee per day increased risk of myocardial infarction by 64% overall. Whereas if you had the fast gene and drank coffee, you actually had decreased risk. So it's always a double-sided answer to that question about coffee. From a detox perspective, I just like people to get off caffeine so that they can get in touch with their stress level, how well are they focused, what is their energy level like. I also think that coffee is a very acidic substance. Yes, it is chock full of phytochemicals, but I think, too much coffee all the time really can mask a lot of our physiology. I'm going to move past this a bit. I just thought it was very interesting for those of you who do any form of Ayurvedic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine. What I'm finding in the literature is some matchup now with genomic medicine. So a lot of the doshas in Ayurvedic medicine are now being correlated with these cytochrome P450 enzyme systems, and we're seeing a correlation between them. So the pitta has been shown to be more of the fast metabolizer, the vata even faster in some of these cytochrome systems. So I just thought as just an interesting point to show you how traditional medicine is now coming under the lens of these detoxification pathways and being validated for these different constitutional types. All right, so I also put in here, if we're just focused on CYP1A1, what would we do here if we had a patient who had low activity of 1A1? How could we stimulate it? And these are some of the foods. So again, I'm just showing you some reference material here. Flavonoids, a lot of the citrus foods are very beneficial for sometimes inducing and sometimes inhibiting some of these enzymes. So that's why when we think of grapefruit juice as an inhibitor of 3A4, we just have to think about, typically what I do is I have patients not do as much citrus when they're doing a detox, just so we don't have a lot of complication, or at least not a high amount, not a lot of it. We know that citrus lemon, there's this idea that citrus is alkalizing. I don't really know what that means. I haven't seen science on it, but what I do know about citrus is that it contains a lot of bioactives that modify these cytochrome systems, which in turn could have some positive effect on the liver. So I put in this for you, and again, we don't have to go through it, but this is, if you want patients to do this through food, how can they support that first phase of detox that they go through in the liver, right? So giving them foods, and you're going to see a lot of, I'm sure that you're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, she has a lot of meat on here. Well, it doesn't mean that your patient has to eat meat if they are a vegan. It's just that a lot of these nutrients just happen to be found in meat. All right, and I also have in here just some studies on organically grown food. That question always comes up during a detox, whether or not they should actually purchase organic food. Great studies showing that organic beef, in this case, was able to reduce LDL cholesterol after a meal versus just fast food beef. Organically grown crops tend to have lower, at least in this study, lower cadmium content, which I think is interesting, right? Just different soil and practices. And also, I'll just summarize this one for you. Essentially what we see here is greater amounts of phytochemicals. And typically we think of vitamin C or some of those big vitamins, but even the phytochemicals are enhanced or increased in organically grown food. That's probably intuitive, but from a detox perspective, when people say, should I make that additional purchase for detox? Should I really spend the money? What I say is yes, it's eating smarter in terms of getting you the polyphenols and the things that you need to adequately detoxify. At the environmental working group site, some of your patients may not have the funds to actually buy everything organic, of course. And in the case that they're not able to, you can always give them this list of the Clean 15 on the left, the foods that are considered clean, relatively clean of pesticide residues, and the Dirty Dozen. It is advised to buy those foods. Apples, it's so interesting that apples are one of the most contaminated foods. And so I have patients scrub. I talk with them about washing your produce as you bring it home from the grocery store. There have been some initial studies that showed that using some kind of biodegradable detergent and scrubbing was most effective in getting any kind of pesticide residues off. So cruciferous vegetables, if there's just one thing that they bring in to change their liver function, bringing in cruciferous vegetables, and it's not just broccoli. There are so many different kinds of cruciferous vegetables out there, and these crucifers are filled with glucosinolates, which help with detoxification in the liver. I just thought, usually my patients like to have these cooking tips or how can they maximize things. This study in particular showed that adding powdered mustard seeds, just the little mustard seeds that you can buy as a spice, to boiling water to cook broccoli. And Johanna Lampe has shown that cooking broccoli for 1 minute 30 seconds has been shown, like when broccoli gets that bright green? That's like the time that detoxification constituents within the broccoli are optimized and more bioavailable. So adding a little bit of mustard seed to the water that you're just steaming them in is good. After the liver goes through phase 1, we get all of these reactive compounds that form. So if you just look here, there are a number of different antioxidants that can be seen as protective. So making sure, this is why we want plant foods built into a detox, to help protect against a lot of those metabolites. So what I put in here for you is, and you can just print this off for patients and say, I want you to get these types of foods. These are going to be protective and support your liver as you're producing and changing your metabolism. And then the final is the last official stage within the liver, phase 2, where essentially we take this hydrophilic compound that's been formed and conjugate it to more or less neutralize it so it can go out of the body. So there are a number of these different enzymes in the body, and again, we have genetic polymorphisms. So I'm just putting up here some of the different ones. You can read those at your leisure. There's glucuronidation, many different forms of this enzyme. This is how we get estrogen out of the body, as I mentioned before. What's really interesting is that if you start to look at the literature and the different chronic conditions, there is an association between dysfunction in certain of these enzyme groups. Johanna Lampe's group actually showed that you can reduce the impact towards cancer, and you can reduce cancer risk for people that have impairments in glucuronidation through dietary intervention with cruciferous vegetables. Really key. If there's just one thing you take away from today, I would say to really maximize those cruciferous vegetables, and steaming them is so important. Sulfation, getting those sulfur constituents is also important for the liver, right? That's why they have protein too. And it's showing here that in this study, part of what these toxins do, as I mentioned early on, is they bind up different enzymes. So in this case, these the hydrocarbons can bind sulfur-containing enzymes. So then you get issues with estrogen again because estrogen is typically sulfated. Parkinson's, also some issues with glutathione transferase, which is one of those phase 2 enzymes. So can we help people prevent a lot of these neurological conditions by giving them nutrients to override any type of genetic variability, right? So when we look at glutathione S transferase, and I'm just giving you here just a snapshot of some clinical things that you could do for people that have some genetic variability in this enzyme, looking at vitamin C, looking at N-acetylcysteine, silymarin, cruciferous vegetables, a lot of these things can help with its detoxification potential. Now, I also put this in here for you in case some of you are a little bit more seasoned in this field. It's been thought for many years that glutathione does not cross the gut barrier. But this study that just came out last year actually showed that it can be transported across the intestinal epithelial cells. So that's really good news from a clinical perspective, is taking in glutathione. So I just put this up here for you, a quick summary of looking at some of these key phase 2 enzymes in the liver and what are the foods that support those different groups. One of the things to be thinking about is balancing all of these different phases in the liver, phase 1 and phase 2. And if that's not balanced appropriately, sometimes that's where we start to see the side effects of the detoxification. So some of the causes of that would be the following: seeing an overwhelming toxic exposure where somebody can't take those toxicants from phase 1 and shuttle them over into phase 2. Maybe they're not eliminating right, they have deficient macronutrients and a deficiency of just things to help detoxify. So really important to make sure that these liver processes are really finessed from one to the next. All right, I think it would be useful. I have a lot of information for you in the PowerPoint, and you can review the slides at your leisure. There's, I think that just covering the liver as we did is very key, and I have a lot of clinical type of charts and tables in there on foods and different supplements. But I want to reserve the last 10 minutes to field questions. So more specific questions about different things to do during a detox, different things to look for, different tests to leverage. So Mark, perhaps we can use the mic there, and all right, we can go from there.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. The first thing, I just want to make a request that you do the busy woman cleanse again, the detox again, because I couldn't do it because I was going to be here and I knew I was going to be busy. And I also want to invite my patients to do it because in my practice, I'm not really at a place where I can create my own detox program, so I'm just encouraging you to do it again.
Oh, very good.
And then I have a more specific question regarding the probiotic that helps with the estrogen, getting elimination. So do you know specifically which one that is?
Yes, the Lactobacillus acidophilus, the NCFM strain, is good for that. That one primarily has the research around the beta-glucuronidase. Yep, you're welcome.
I had a question about specific kinds of liquid chlorophyll that you use, like to add to water, and I was wondering whether you provide any specific recipes, like your turmeric milkshake or your other kinds of things, because that's always nice to have.
It's helpful. Yeah. So she's asking about the dose of chlorophyll. If they're buying this from a health food store, there are a variety of different brands that they can choose. Typically, I like for them to choose one without sugar. I really want them to read the labels. There are some very pure. The one that I have them use is just one with chlorophyll and mint. I forgot the name of the brand just right now, but it's just a very basic one. It has a little bit of glycerin in it. So they just put this chlorophyll in their water, about 1/4 teaspoon. So, chlorophyll is just the general antioxidant that we get from plant foods anyway. So it's just one additional way that we can get an additional one of these very potent antioxidants. Also, it should help them with body odor, actually. It helps to bind a lot of these toxins. And one of the things that I hear from people that do a detox and start doing more plant foods is just changing body odors, right? And just they're changing deodorants though too. You know, they're changing some of these personal care products. And being that the chlorophyll does bind, it's really no surprise because you're getting rid of a lot of things in the gut anyway. As far as the turmeric milkshake, so that recipe really quickly, and I don't get stuck on total amounts, but I'm asking them to do like coconut water, or they can do coconut milk. Coconut is great during a detox because it fuels the liver and the enterocytes with readily available energy, gives them energy for the brain. And then to put in almonds, like a scant handful of almonds, 1 medjool date without the pit, and then a pretty big heaping teaspoon of turmeric, ginger, cardamom, and sometimes I will have them do a little bit of maca in that as well, maca root powder, and they blend it up. It tastes great. It's actually, it just kind of has that nice spice taste, and it also helps to fuel the liver very well.
Hi, I'm a nurse practitioner from San Diego. Is that Toxin Summit available still?
The
online?
Detox Summit, sure. If you go to the detoxsummit.com, you can find it. Yep.
And the second question, regarding the chlorophyll, would wheatgrass be like a couple ounces of pure wheatgrass?
You know what? I don't have patients do any grasses during a cleanse because for people that have any kind of gluten issues, there still is kind of the mimicry of even the very immature grain, and I have seen some people react to that. So I just eliminate all grasses when they go on a cleanse, just to make sure everything is as pure as possible.
And what is your feeling about coffee enemas?
Coffee enemas.
So I know some cancer patients.
Yeah, I know. It's part of the various protocols for cancer patients. My preference is to go oral with everything rather than to do enemas. I have worked with patients that have done them. I think under certain controlled settings where they're being monitored pretty closely, there are a lot of issues with hygiene, perforations, just even changes in motility that may not be good long term. It just depends on how it's used and under what supervision. But I always prefer just to get the gut working right from top down,
Okay, thank you.
the natural way. It's good. I mean, all these questions come up, right, whenever we hear that word detox.
I just wondered if you're familiar at all with the infrared rays and like with sauna, does that really work? And also there's, I guess, the biomats here. I mean, with those infrarays, is that a good thing for detox or
Right.
too much? Or
So I can't speak to biomats. I have no clinical experience. I can speak to infrared saunas. And just in my talking with Dr. Jenis and other people that are they use them clinically, saunas can be a very good thing. The infrared saunas are nice because the patient can be in there, especially for my autoimmune patients, they love it. It helps to reduce inflammation if they're in there for a certain period of time and they start sweating. And it's not one of those dry, uncomfortable saunas where they feel like they can't breathe. So yes to an infrared sauna. I personally have one, which shows you how much I believe in it and how I've looked into the research on it. There's more research on the side of just sweating in a dry sauna than there is on the infrared side, but there is some emerging work on infrared saunas as well. So I think all in all, I think it's good. I do think, though, after the sauna, people have to use the sauna properly in terms of coming out and actually dampening down the heat. For some patients that are too inflamed, sometimes they could get the heat too high and they just kind of set off certain things. Even though it's good because they're sweating, they need that cold shower or something to then turn off that process. That's the only thing I've observed. That's just more anecdotal. That's not science-based.
okay, and you have an infrared sauna yourself.
I sure do.
Okay, great.
Love it. Who else has a sauna, an infrared sauna? I'm not the
infrared.
only one. Yeah. You don't have one? Just a regular one. Okay, good.
Hi, I'm curious what your opinion is on green juices as a source of increased phytonutrients. They're low sugar. The decrease of fiber
Yeah.
almost allows the person to take in more of those phytonutrients because it's not filling.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you're right. You have to take it on a patient-by-patient basis. So for people with really impaired digestion or with SIBO, where they get a lot of bloating after having a lot of fiber, the green juices, I think, are fine. I don't tend to, again, use a lot of the grasses that you're speaking to. And also, For people with thyroid conditions that start doing a lot of green juices, what may be good is, and I've been doing this clinically, is I'll have them just steam the kale, steam the greens quickly before they toss them into their blender, just to inactivate the goitrogens or anything that can interfere with thyroid function. So, and especially because I've had patients where they get really hooked on these green smoothies, they're doing them every day, then I just start to wonder about long-term. And I know that, the thyroid is not typically going to be very vulnerable to that unless they're kind of teetering on the edge where they're subclinical hypothyroid and they have some other issues there. So I think in the context of a mixed meal, I think it's good. It's still going to be high glycemic, so you have to keep that in mind for diabetic patients and patients with metabolic syndrome. But I think that in the context of a mixed meal is fine. Yeah, could be very medicinal. Greens overall are wonderful for detox. Yes.
Resources in the
I sure do. I have a
the
whole thing on
slides.
turmeric.
You
Yep.
do.
And I did a webinar. It's available to you for your patients. I did it for the retreat. I work for a cancer retreat center, just a nonprofit organization. And I did a webinar for them on spices, and it's very patient-oriented. So if you go to, Harmony Hill Retreat Center, and you look at their webinar archive, they should have one all about the spices. And the sources, yep. I talk about cooking, I talk about medicinal properties, and I talk about how to incorporate more, and I also talk about what are the good spices to buy. And I talk about brand names in there as well, because it's a non-commercial. Yeah.
I just have a very quick question because as I go through the slides, a lot of your tablets data are not in this
Yes,
current.
and I mentioned that in the beginning,
Oh, I'm
that
sorry,
I've
I missed
revised
that.
this a bit, so
Yeah.
you have even more information. And that will be, all the final slides will be uploaded onto the website and available to you. Yeah, I have a ton of stuff in here for you guys.
Can you make the whole juice in advance and freeze it or store it for a period of time and it still be effective?
Okay, so go by color. Many times when we're, anytime you see that change in color where it becomes darker, you've started to lose a lot of the antioxidant potential. So freezing is preferred over just putting in the refrigerator. And in fact, a lot of the studies show that you preserve your phytonutrients quite well in berries and in other foods just by freezing. It's not optimal, and I know it's also not practical. So if it comes down to the patient can only make this smoothie and store it, and that's how they're going to drink it, then that's the better. You definitely want to make it accessible and convenient. Yep.
What advice do you have for type 2 diabetics to maximize insulin sensitivity?
Yes. Oh, what is your question about
Oh,
them?
how do you maximize insulin sensitivity?
How do you
through-
maximize it? You can maximize insulin sensitivity actually through the spices and through a lot of these phytochemicals. In fact, there was one paper that showed that inclusion of 1 serving of greens per day had reduced the risk of type 2 diabetes by almost 15%. I mean, the bitter greens for diabetics is wonderful because you're actually helping with their metabolism. So just getting them, and sweating and moving, some of the basic things that we would already be thinking are also very detoxifying for them. So greens for diabetics, getting some movement, getting them to sweat. A lot of them that I work with, movement is a challenge. Nutrition is easy, movement is their challenge. And then getting them on, if they have challenges with nutrition, getting them on a medical food or some type of product that is designed to really focus on insulin sensitivity. And there are a number of them available, and I use them as well.
I have another comment question about the juices, because I too find that it's a very concentrated form of phytonutrients, but I just recommend and practice myself to either eat avocado or some coconut oil with it so that it provides, because fat is what we see that helps with insulin response the quickest.
Yes.
As a physical way of keeping it in our stomach longer to
That's right.
release
That's a
it
good
slower.
idea. Yep.
So that's just something that I've done, and especially in avocado because you get fiber in addition
Yeah.
to the fat, which are the 2 keys for
Yeah.
insulin response.
Yeah, that's yes, absolutely. And I think, too, avocado, I think, is a great food for detox. I'm glad that you brought that up. I do, yes, he's happy in the back. I do when I'm traveling the avocado taco. I don't even need a spoon. I just smash it up, and I tell patients this. All these little tips. They're looking for that kind of stuff. I want you to take this away before you leave. I do think in order to maximize, don't forget what I said about the cooking of vegetables. I do think that steaming, there's a slide in here which is going to show you that out of all these vegetables, when they were cooked, you potentiate the amounts of nutrients and how bioavailable they are to the body. So when your patient comes in and they want to do like a raw juice fast cleanse, this is essentially not giving them the full potential of phytonutrients that they can be getting. Yes?
She had mentioned the Busy Woman Cleanse. Is there a way to get onto your, do you have stuff that you send out to people on your
patients?
website?
Yeah. My website is foodandspirit.com. And then there's also the detoxsummit.com. And that's also in the presentation. But yeah, I do regular detox, large group. And there's something about doing a detox in a group setting that is unlike a one-on-one. I have to tell you, the support that you get, especially when I'm just working with women, women just love to tell what they're doing and what their recipes are and the struggles that they're having, and they just get it all out on the page, and it's great. And then I have webinars, and so I'm teaching them as we go along, what are the foods that they need. So it's a very enriching environment, a very great experience to witness this. All right, so we're going to close, but if you have additional questions, I'm going to be here. It's 12:05, so I want to let the people that want to go and eat lunch to do that, and then I'll be here to answer any other questions. Thank you very much.